Okay, hi, welcome everyone. My name is Ashley Dawson. I am a professor at the City University of New York and an activist with the Public Power New York campaign and also the co-founder of the Public Power Observatory. And I'm very happy to be joined today by Rosie Hampton of Friends of the Earth Scotland. Welcome, Rosie.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Great. Thank you for making time to speak with us. So the way I was thinking of doing things is giving a little bit of an introduction to our conversation. And by the way, I will link to some of your writing, Rosie, in the chat later. Um, and after giving a bit of an introduction, I'll then ask you a few questions by way of opening up a conversation about Scotland and energy transition, which I hope will be an interesting kind of platform for a comparative discussion of what it's like to fight for meaningful energy transition in a petrostate. And then we'll open the floor for questions from the rest of the audience. But of course, if a question comes up in the course of my questions to Rosie, feel free to put your question in the chat and I'll collect them and come back to them. Okay, everyone? All right, great. So by way of introduction, it should be obvious to everyone that the US is a petrostate. The US just elected Donald Trump. He is already moving to dismantle the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, the kind of signal Green New Deal energy transition measure put in place by his predecessor, Joe Biden. And Trump, of course, ran on a platform of drill, baby, drill. So, we know what the federal government is going to be doing over the next 4 years. And it's really bad news for energy transition and for climate activism and climate justice, not just in the US, but internationally. But it's not as if his Democratic predecessor was any paradigm of, really radical action either, right? Joe Biden, yes, put in place the Inflation Reduction Act, but he also supported a lot of build out of fossil fuels economically and was trying to export as much liquefied natural gas as possible to Europe and other parts of the world. So, I think it's undeniable that the U.S. has been and remains a petrostate. And it's not just the US. The world is essentially, as Brett Christopher has pointed out in his book last year, The Price is Wrong, the world is essentially going through an energy addition, not an energy transition. In other words, very few petrostates have shut down their fossil fuels while also building out significant renewables to replace them. To some, Scotland appears to be an exception to this. And this is why I wanted to have the conversation with Rosie. So according to energytransition.org, renewable technologies generated the equivalent of 113% of Scotland's overall electricity consumption in 2022. And for quite some time, Scotland's politicians have been depicting it as the Saudi Arabia of renewables. Perhaps this is not entirely hyperbole. The country's home to the world's first community-owned tidal array, to the first floating offshore wind farm, and has one of Europe's largest hydrogen bus fleets. In addition, Scotland has an ambitious target of generating 50% of total energy demand across electricity, heat, and transport by renewable sources by 2030, at least according to that article that I'm citing from energytransition.org, which is about a year old. But it's worth noting that that same article, which is talking about some of the successes of Scotland's energy transition, notes that the country's progress towards energy transition has stalled. So I'm hoping that Rosie can give us a sense of what here is accurate, what are the victories that have been won by activists in the fight for energy transition in Scotland, what some of the major obstacles have been, and what kinds of strategies for the future activists like Friends of the Earth and other groups have been using to move energy transition forward in Scotland. And of course, I'm hoping that we can, here in the US and specifically in New York, with the Public Power New York campaign, can learn some things from what folks are doing in Scotland. Okay, so Rosie, again, welcome. Great to have you. Let's perhaps start with a bit of a sense of the history of Scotland as a petrostate, and what led to the country embarking on its energy transition, and then maybe we can get into some of the kind of what you think some of the successes have been, and then afterwards we can delve into some of the real obstacles and the ways that things have not been going forward the way you'd like to see. So start us off with, the history of Scotland as a petrostate, perhaps.
Sure, thank you so much. So, I mean, often I think we're looking at going back to the kind of 1970s in Scotland when we're d kind of framing it in the longer view of the discovery, quote unquote, of kind of North Sea oil and gas, and kind of people really mark that in 1975, and it was a big not only kind of discovery in terms of the political economy of energy in Scotland, but also in terms of how that was framed in the broader drives for kind of Scottish independence, for example. So the kind of history of that development is very much intertwined within Scotland as a kind of modern, like the kind of later half of the 20th century and the kind of nation making and that ideological drive behind the Scottish National Party of saying, it's Scotland's oil, it's, this is how we are going to kind of fund ourselves, and this is how we'll be kind of making the case for why we should kind of like cut away. And that you can kind of mark it back till then, and kind of it's poetic in a sense because um ultimately the kind of energy conversation in Scotland, beginning with oil, started on the terms of an unjust transition at the time. Not It's not often kind of pulled into that story, but if you look back at kind of the experiences of places in the Northeast, which are often kind of put forward as, the big beneficiaries of the oil industry and, the making of the Northeast, which has its merits in some sense, there was also a lot of kind of community demolishment. The village of Old Torry in Aberdeen was bulldozed essentially for making way for kind of oil and gas industry infrastructure. And you can kind of draw parallels with that today with some of the ways in which the kind of renewables transition has been taken up by Scottish government and private industry as well. So the parallels between what happened then at the beginning of one energy transition to what we're seeing now are kind of eerily reminiscent of one another. I think in general, we've kind of seen over the past kind of SNP and then SNP Greens and then SNP Scottish government, the kind of move to, again, this need to drive for renewables and recognizing that kind of with the release of the IPCC report in 2019 and kind of taking that on, coming through with the Climate Change Act and legislating on our need to kind of meet these climate targets. There has been a lot of good talk around what Scotland should be doing in terms of transitioning to renewable energy, but I think that Brett Christopher's quote very much rings true for Scotland as well. I think the kind of key players are still looking at fossil fuel expansion, not only offshore in the North Sea, but onshore as well. One of our kind of primary campaigns at Friends of the Earth Scotland is to stop a new gas-fired power station with carbon capture and storage in Peterhead in the northeast of Scotland. So that decision sits with the Scottish government and is one of the few kind of energy-related decisions that isn't reserved to Westminster. So there's a very complex picture of how Scotland is kind of putting forward this, front of kind of we are, wants to be seen as a kind of climate leader on the world stage. We hosted COP in 2021, which is, kind of often part of the narrative of progression, but really there are lots of kind of discrepancies in how, that's kind of happened. But alongside that, one of the real stories of hope and kind of activism is that of grassroots community campaigners who have kind of been at the forefront of demanding public ownership of energy and how communities and workers can reap the benefits of that rather than it being a kind of piecemeal, tokenistic way in which, like, say, a couple of community groups get a say, or they get, a tiny kind of sliver of the profits that companies that are investing in renewables bring to different communities. Rather, there's a kind of opposing narrative emerging in the work of campaigners and groups on the ground to say there is another way in which we can reclaim the energy transition and have it be a redistributive process rather than remaking kind of renewables in the same broken image in which the oil and gas industry has operated for so long. And I think we're seeing kind of different coalitions, not just within the climate movement, but like emerging across the labor movement as well, kind of slowly in different ways. We've done a lot of kind of work with offshore oil and gas workers over the past 5 years at Friends of the Earth Scotland, which has kind of formed a lot of our most meaningful coalitions. And I think the story depends on the perspective, and I think from the bottom up, there's lots of reasons to be hopeful, but it's the kind of the state-led story at the moment has raised a lot of criticisms for a lot of people, but that is what's kind of galvanizing a lot of action as well.
Great. Thank you so much. A lot of interesting things to think about there. I wanted to come back to what you said about arguments around energy sovereignty. Um, you know, this is something that's very evident at the moment in the US, right? With Trump touting his plans for American energy dominance, sort of, but even more so for many global South countries. India recently published a plan to develop its coal resources, and the BJP government there is talking about the need to be independent and not dependent on other countries for energy. So it seems like that's also very much a part of the kind of dominant narrative in Scotland around energy, first in relation to North Sea oil. But then, if I understand what you're saying correctly, renewables also got kind of folded into that narrative. So it's interesting, because it picks up on a kind of anti-colonial or decolonial rhetoric. So I wonder how are movements challenging that idea of sovereignty and autonomy from, domination, which I think has some popular appeal to it for obvious reasons in a country that's been dominated by other countries, as is the case in Scotland for so many centuries.
Yeah, I think we are often careful with the kind of language of um yeah, kind of inter connectedness and kind of energy as well, mainly because when we look at the renewables transition here, so much of it is dependent on resources from other countries in general. Like you look at kind of the minerals, the transition minerals that would be necessary to build things like wind turbines, and would be, kind of look at where the supply chains for those manufacturing kind of chains currently sit. And ultimately, we're looking at places in the global south where we would need kind of these transition minerals to come from. So we're always kind of like a bit skeptical of the narrative that we can, that energy security means being a kind of like the line that it's like, well, we need to produce our own energy, we need to do this and that. And it's like, well, actually the ways in which our energy is currently produced, the kind of the output might be one thing, even though a lot of it is kind of exported rather than actually kind of used here. But the actual materials that go into, building the things that produce our energy are very much not currently made in Scotland. And that's one of the things that we're very critical of, because we think there should be a much bigger kind of domestic manufacturing base, not least because that's how, local jobs are created, the carbon footprint of import is reduced, and also taking responsibility for the fact that there is a lot of harm done along these kind of supply chains when it comes to mining and, displacing communities, not having any mandate on these companies to do due diligence along their supply chains. So I think there it, it's kind of that balance of where is our energy kind of used and where is the benefits of that kept, but then also kind of recognizing that this kind of independent nation, like, solely kind of standing on its own 2 feet, is like we're actually standing on quite a lot of, colonial legacies of production when it comes to like how these things will be built, and we have to be mindful of that. So when, talking about our kind of just transition imperatives and the targets that we need to meet and what's necessary here, that can't be done without taking account for the kind of global picture. And I think any, country that claims to be, separate from that is not taking a kind of actual look at the wider implications of what their energy transition means. And that's been hard to kind of adopt at a we try and build links kind of across different climate movements. Friends of Your Scotland is part of an international network that connects groups all around the world, across the global north and global south. But it means having those tricky conversations. Some groups think that there's no mining that can be done anywhere for these minerals that would be kind of ethical or part of a just transition. And what does that mean for demand reduction of energy in general, and trying to kind of build kind of coalitions of solidarity across some of these really tricky questions.
Yeah, this is definitely one of the biggest questions that we face today. I don't know if you've come across Thea Riofrancos and some comrades did a very interesting study about transition minerals and mining and how to reduce dependence through various degrowth strategies, recycling, and it really crunches numbers in a way that's quite interesting, that shows how different policies can lead to quite radically different amounts of energy use, and consequently, extraction, essentially, as you pointed out, in global south sites like, the lithium triangle in South America. And so those are hugely important questions that we're all struggling with, I think. Meanwhile, we're also trying to shut down fossil fuels and to a certain extent also figure out the kind of reindustrialization strategy, which I think you were alluding to. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, because, in the struggle for public power and in Green New Deal proposals more broadly, one of the sort of incentives has been the idea that energy transition and a Green New Deal more broadly is going to benefit labor and lead to a kind of reindustrialization strategy that's going to also head off the sort of right-wing backlash that we're seeing folks like Trump exploit all too cannily. The problem in the US, at least, has been that the renewable sector is overwhelmingly privatized and non-unionized and pays about half of what jobs in fossil fuel sector pay. So for that reason, it's been quite hard to convince some labor unions, particularly in the trades, to come on side, essentially. And there are good reasons to be skeptical about that, given the lack of legislative support for just transition. So I wonder whether you've struggled with these kinds of issues, and what labor unions what role labor unions have played in the transition there, and what the approach has been to these kinds of questions of how to cope with the privatization of this sector.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's, it's a pretty mirror picture in Scotland in many ways. I think, we have seen it on like a day-to-day level, even when we're kind of working with offshore oil and gas workers. We did a report nearly 2 years ago now, which essentially worked with like a number of different unions, and essentially like surveyed nearly like just over 1,500 offshore oil and gas workers and brought some of them together to kind of come up with a set of demands, which came under the heading Our Power. And we're still in touch with a number of those workers who do like kind of make the move kind of on a casual basis, because a lot of them are kind of casualized workers and will take on like some contracts on oil rigs, but they have had some experience kind of working within kind of offshore wind farms, or dealing with these companies. And you get kind of firsthand stories of like workers saying to you, I did that work, terms and conditions in the oil and gas sector have been declining for a long time. One of the reasons that we were able, I think, to capitalize on people being interested in speaking to us was we were kind of doing that research during COVID when a third of the workforce were made redundant pretty much overnight. So there was a lot of people wanting to kind of say like, this idea of a job in oil and gas as a job for life has kind of gone far out the window, and workers know that acutely. But then when they go to kind of these private wind companies and they're chasing them for their wages for weeks after they finish the job, it's very difficult to make the argument that there is a benefit to them transitioning, because what are they seeing in real terms? They're not. They're, a lot of the people we spoke to were very interested in a transition to renewables. One of the things that they identified as a problem with fossil fuels and working there is that it did feel very insecure and kind of working contract to contract, and job security was like the number one thing that came out as a priority for any move to renewables. But if the kind of same attitude and the same kind of ways of working are being taken by these private wind companies, then we're kind of losing the argument on material conditions, and that's been very much bedded in by the Scottish government, in the way in which they've kind of handled the way, like the development of offshore wind as a sector. You mentioned there about kind of the manufacturing and the mass potential. Like we see that too, and it would be a really, really useful, message to get across, because you often see like some more reactionary Labour voices kind of saying like, well, the green jobs revolution can't be my members delivering pizzas on an electric bike. Like they want good terms and conditions as well as, that what they're used to, which we agree with. But actually the narrative could be that this is a moment of reindustrialization for the economy in Scotland, because there is so much manufacturing work that needs to be undertaken, but the kind of infrastructure around that is so lacking. So we the way in which the kind of offshore wind seabed is managed and licensed in Scotland is through the Crown Estate of Scotland, which is kind of through the Crown. So it's essentially kind of an auction that private developers can bid for sectors of it for development, which already starts you off on the wrong foot, in the sense of not increasing public ownership of our energy in the ways in which it would be beneficial. But no, but it is problematic and it isn't good. The developers then made commitments as part of their kind of investment bid to say X amount will be committed in Scotland, and jobs here and kind of investment here in manufacturing, etc. But the Scottish Trade Union Congress did some research to show that if the Scotland want ScotWind developers to be able to honour all of those investment commitments, they need, for example, with offshore wind, 19 fabrication yards to build the different components. They need those places set up. And we currently have none. And there are two in development with like the relevant planning permission and funding, but there is a massive gap between investment in our manufacturing base in comparison to the actual what's needed, which means that even private developers are like, well, I'll just do this elsewhere. So we lose that massive potential that we were already kind of on the back foot from, which then, as people on the climate side who are taking the industrial policy seriously, that again, how do you make that argument when trade unions are saying to you, where are the jobs? And it's hard not to agree with them. And I think British trade unions in general, overall, the kind of strongest voices in the offshore energy sector, say Unite, who are a kind of general union but have a lot of members offshore. Same with RMT, which is the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union. They are kind of trying to straddle that line of wanting, needing to take a bit of the defensive position of like defending their members' jobs, whilst also coming up with a proactive industrial strategy that says this is inevitable. We know that it's inevitable that we'll need to transition, but we are not seeing the jobs materialize that we can say to our members, these are going to be here. So there's a real, yeah, it kind of, it's a real spectrum of kind of trying to manage those relationships. And we've been kind of doing some on the ground campaigning and have had pretty frank conversations, and constructive but frank conversations across kind of climate groups to trade union reps to say like, we understand that we have different sets of messaging, but we are all invested in this. And, that can make it, yeah, like it can be, yeah, definitely a difficult set of negotiations, as coalitions always are, but we usually come to the same conclusion of more investment, more manufacturing, upskilling, skills pathways, making it easier for workers to transition by standardizing their safety and technical qualifications. There are kind of ways and means that you can nail down what the policy and campaign demands are, but it definitely, yeah, it's not an easy landscape to be navigating with so many of these kind of hindrances that sound similar to what you have in the States.
Yeah, yeah. And, I think these things are global. The sort of domestic content requirement that you mentioned, X amount of projects have to be done with Scottish labor unions employed, reminds me also of the way that energy transition is structured in South Africa, where there's the same sort of thing, uh, foreign energy companies will come in and do the projects, but there's a sort of domestic quota for the amount of South African labor that should be employed, but it's very low in terms of the amount of folks who should be employed. And obviously, in a place like South Africa, which has 40% official unemployment, probably much higher actual unemployment, the lack of jobs makes it much harder to sell energy transition to people politically. So I guess that really raises big questions about the way that the transition is structured with these kind of public-private partnerships, So as you were saying, government controls the sites where renewable energy is going to go in, and it does these auctions for bids from private companies that are going to actually build this stuff. And only a relatively small amount of manufacturing is actually allocated to Scottish labor. So that really raises the question of why there isn't some kind of industrial policy nationally to do this work, funded through the government, and actually done as a policy. And I know that the Labour Party coming in had this idea of Great British Energy, but I'm not sure that it departs all that much from the neoliberal policies which were in place under the Tories. So. I wonder, what your sense of the possibility of some alternative arrangement could be, and how people are thinking about that politically. And then we also have a question from one of the listeners, from Nancy Romer, my comrade at City University of New York, about whether the labor movement is pushing for nuclear energy, and how you're dealing with that. We're seeing a lot of hype about nuclear power at the moment in the US. A lot of it is coming from the big tech firms that are all not able to keep to their promises of going net zero because AI consumes so much electricity. So, they're backing all these ideas of small modular nuclear reactors and trying to get the labor movement excited about that. So, yeah, I guess that sort of two questions about the possibility of a kind of national industrial policy, and then kind of linked to that, funding, and how funding this kind of work could be really done in the public interest, and then Nancy's question about nuclear energy.
Yeah, it's so bizarre about GB Energy because it really has been it was the flag one of the flagship policies of the Labour's kind of campaign for election and things, and they kind of let it be everything and nothing at once, for kind of more conservative industry voices. They let it be just, an add to the portfolio, whereas at some points they kind of insinuated that it was going to form and it was going to be able to generate energy, and it would be a publicly owned venture, and it would, bring bills down. So they kind of let it be just this like Schrodinger's GB Energy. In some ways, it was really bizarre, and we still don't have it, much detail on it that it really, as you say, kind of sets it out as anything different from where before. It was fascinating being in Scotland when the first announcement of how it was feasibly going to work, because they were kind of saying like, oh, it's going to be auctioned through the Crown Estate again. It's like, well, that's what we do already with Scotland and our kind of like in the Crown Estate Scotland. That's exactly the same procedure. It's not a, it's not a way in which to kind of ensure that the kind of assets are publicly owned. There's kind of nothing there. It kind of socializes all of the risk and privatizes all of the eventual benefit because it allows kind of private interest to kind of come in. And there was so much chat about like where the headquarters would be and whether it should be in Aberdeen or whether it should be in Glasgow. And everyone was having really strong opinions with, as and we were kind of saying, if it's a way in which we're going to generate energy, then yeah, bring it to Aberdeen and have it be a publicly owned venture that can create jobs. But if it's just going to be a hub for hedge fund managers, then it doesn't matter where it is because it's like completely kind of irrelevant. And we've kind of been saying that this could be a potential vehicle through which to kind of expand public ownership of energy in Britain. And in Scotland as well, the SNP government in 2017 promised that they were going to bring in a publicly owned energy company, which they've just let fall off every policy agenda ever since. And previous leadership said, under Nicola Sturgeon, said that was going to come in, and then it has just been completely forgotten, which is amusing to watch them criticize the kind of false promise of GB Energy when they conveniently forget that that has fallen off their kind of policy agenda as well. But yeah, ultimately, I think the the money and what is being put behind all of these as kind of industrial policies and both at Scottish government and UK government level is severely lacking. Labour punted a very well-known figure throughout all of their election campaign around 28 billion, and around that would be what they would put behind their green policy agenda, which then was dropped. I don't think it even made it to July 4th when the election happened. But they were very kind of cautious and they've kind of dialed it back. But really, whatever their investment commitments, they've not really made enough. Campaigners that I work with across an organization called Platform, and then at kind of Uplift and Greenpeace, we all kind of came together recently to say you need to commit 1.9 billion in funding every year for the next 5 years, essentially, to kind of fund the green transition. Kind of that would go into creating jobs in terms of upgrading our ports and providing kind of training pathways. And we were very clear. We said, if you're looking for money for this, you can tax oil and gas profits. You can bring in a much stronger windfall tax, which it would be actually a drop in the ocean compared to what they're making recently. And the way in which industry has reacted has been as scaremongering as you can expect. They put new polling out just today to say that it's not working, and they're really rattled. But we really need to be thinking seriously about how much public money is going into keeping up a private sector which is perfectly happy to ignore the energy transition at all. I think there's 87 North Sea oil and gas companies that are operating in the North Sea, and only 7 of them have any plans to invest anything in renewables by 2030. Yet so much public money goes into kind of fossil fuel subsidies, and so much kind of kind of hand-wringing goes into whether we should be taxing them more. And it's just kind of, it feels very surreal to be looking at what needs to happen and who is currently benefiting and who they're so worried about making losses and things. So I think, yeah, the lack of seriousness around industrial policy has been a real criticism of the current Labour government and the last iterations of all kind of Scottish governments as well. And I think that is the thing that we're very keen to hammer home, and what really has built our relationships with trade unions as well, is being clear that you can say all you want about no new licenses, which is crucial, but if you don't have the industrial policy to back that up, then you're not going to win people round who are working in these sectors and etc. So the Scottish government published a paper on their green industrial strategy, which is not worth the paper it was written on, and they've kind of let it fall through the cracks, and there was nothing of note to kind of write in that, despite the name sounding very good. To answer the question on nuclear, yeah, I think there are particular unions with members in those sectors who have been pushing it, and I think in particular, they have put policies forward to kind of the main trade union body in Scotland, the Scottish Trade Union Congress, to say that we should be in a position to be supporting things like small modular reactors. I don't think it hasn't quite kind of ascended, I think, in the past year at least, as to be like, okay, well, we need to start focusing on this, because I think our main kind of concern and kind of patching over the cracks of what needs to be done is the ascendancy of false solutions such as carbon capture and storage. That's been really taken up by Labour in the UK in particular, and that kind of peters out through trade unions in a way that feels it's a new arena of trying to push the skepticism around that and strong opposition. but yeah, there is that kind of defensive mechanism of like, well, we have members in these sectors and this is going to be a necessary thing. Kind of building opposition to that is really difficult. And we've been doing some work with Scottish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament around how we start to expand the conversation out to a just transition for the nuclear sector, which involves winding it down, not bringing it into a nuclear, not bringing in nuclear to into a serious conversation about what is needed. Renewables are cheaper, they're like quicker to operationalize when the investment is there. But that conversation is probably at an earlier stage just because of how oil and gas is dominated and CCS is dominated as a kind of patch over the cracks in kind of substitute to that.
Yeah, thanks so much for that answer. Really, really interesting about industrial policy. Of course, just getting anybody on in the federal government here in the US to publish anything like industrial policy seems absolutely impossible. But there have been efforts here on a more local scale to fight for something like that. Um, there's an environmental justice group here in New York City called Uprose that was fighting an effort to rezone an area that was zoned for industrial production. It's called Industry City. And it got bought up by a developer, a big real estate firm that wanted it rezoned for hotels and commerce. In other words, to make lots of money basically by renting out units in the buildings there on the waterfront in Brooklyn. And Uprose, which is based in the area where Industry City is, it's called Sunset Park, fought hard against the rezoning. And part of their effort, part of their argument was that many people working in light industry would have been displaced from that complex had it been rezoned. But they weren't just trying to fight back against a proposal, they're also trying to propose an alternative. And their alternative was what's called the Green Resilient Industrial District, GRID for short. And the idea was, that this area that has all of these manufacturing facilities could be used to build wind turbines, which we know need to go offshore to power New York City, right? Because we're hugely dependent on power generated outside the city, which is a big political as well as logistical problem. So, there have been efforts to build those kinds of arguments and industrial policies on a far more local level. It would be great, if we could push for a more progressive government in the city, a kind of municipal socialism where those policies could be developed more coherently across the city and ultimately, of course, across the state. We know that for the next 4 years, we're not going to have anything progressive, anything towards energy transition from the federal government. So we need to fight on more local levels. And so to a certain extent, some of those kinds of arguments that we're talking about initially, ideas of energy sovereignty can, I think, be recast. And the public power movement is doing that and sort of arguing for the energy transition, now being stalled on a federal level. We really need to forge forward on a local level and in New York State. So, all of that is to say that I'm very much interested in the kind of political arguments for public power and what kinds of arguments get traction. In addition to these local contexts that I was mentioning to you, I've been working with folks at the Transnational Institute. They're based in Amsterdam, but they have this really interesting network of people working on energy democracy and energy transition. Putting a link in the chat to the Public Power Files, where they have published a series of dossiers about ways to try and articulate the struggle for public power for activists. And I know, Rosie, you've written about that. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, what kinds of arguments that grassroots movements have been making for public power, and what kinds of strategies you see being most effective going forward.
Yeah, I think it it's a really kind of powerful one, I think, for us in Scotland and across the UK in particular, in the after just over the past couple of years. I think it's been building momentum, but in terms of like most recently in 2022, we kind of saw energy bills soar under the kind of global, context and the our kind of the private dominance of yeah, kind of private profit in our energy sector meant that there was like mass increase in price caps for people's bills, which saw, you know, masses of exacerbation of like energy poverty in Scotland and the rest of the UK. And I think people were the kind of language around why is this happening and why are other places more safeguarded from this than we are really was brought into kind of the public consciousness, coupled with mass waves of strike action across, you know, big unions like, again, Unite RMT, who I mentioned earlier, the Communication Workers Union, who cover kind of post office workers, postmen, postwomen, and yeah, just kind of like lots of people saying, you know, my bills are increasing, everything is getting more expensive in a very, very short amount of time. Yet all of my, you know, everybody's employer is saying we haven't got enough money for a real terms pay increase. And I think that kind of um, consciousness and that kind of coupling of both, you know, strike action and kind of trade union activity, coupled with the real failings of the private sector, which could be really seen at a day-to-day level. People are saying, you know, what is the benefit of this? What is the benefit of this to us? And you know, why is the system kind of built in this way? And I think from that we've been able to kind of build a more literacy slowly, and I think kind of more momentum behind, well, why are more things not kind of publicly owned, thinking about that, not just it makes everything cheaper. You know, when we talk about what is needed for the energy transition in general, the amount of coordination and centralization, the way in which the private sector kind of fragments everything and makes it extremely difficult. You're speaking to one person and one company for one thing, and, you know, just to kind of have basic services met. I think people are feeling it acutely across all parts of their lives, whether it's energy or I know, you know, when it comes to kind of, we have a national health service, but there is lots of ways in which privatization creeps in on that in very frustrating and, you know, deadly ways, and in like, you know, the way in which you have to talk to certain people, the outsourcing of different services. I think there's just a lot to be said about how ineffective and inefficient this is for a subpar service and a subpar way of living. And I think the way in which that is kind of built since 2022, coupled with a kind of surge in trade union activity and people taking action against it, we've been able to kind of make that connection of like, okay, well, you know, it doesn't have to be this way. And not only can we have it in a sense of kind of a national picture of things being more kind of in the public interest as well, there are ways in which communities can benefit. And there's not so much, there's not very widespread kind of public ownership of renewables generation in Scotland, but we're trying to kind of build alliances with, you know, local community groups who are organizing and mobilizing to kind of take stakes in community-owned renewables generation, especially in the Northeast. There's kind of a small number of projects in Orkney, and then not even kind of as far north as that, there's a kind of very successful project in North Ayrshire in Scotland as well. And just kind of being able to take that forward and say that there are tangible ways at the local level which would feasibly give you the kind of material benefit tomorrow. Because I think, as you say, whilst we're not facing the kind of next 4 years of the new Trump administration, or kind of parallel to that, we have a poor, terrible neoliberal Labour government in at the minute. I think we're taking it seriously because we're seeing that potentially happen to us in 4 years' time. With, you know, the rise of the Reform Party here in the UK, championed by kind of Nigel Farage, who, you know, is in, well, Elon Musk is favoring him to step down in favor of a worse right-wing candidate as well. But, you know, we are not going to be immune to that happening. I think it's very likely we're seeing them surge in the polls locally. We're very aware of like, people need to feel a material benefit to their lives tomorrow, essentially. We can't be with these kind of like inept national governments who are refusing to do things and kind of take action and be decisive about different things, and to bring people along with them. So I think that local picture of kind of, as you say, like forms of municipal socialism, local ownership, community-owned energy projects are going to be the way in which we can kind of take that back, because a national Labour government isn't going to do it. And if things don't change kind of quickly, we will be seeing, yeah, that the same thing happen. What's happened over the past couple of months in the US, it's very like I don't want it to be, and we're going to organize so that, you know, we can put our power into it. But then yeah, the national government will sleepwalk in a very right-wing fascist party in 2029 when our next general election is, which is it's incredibly concerning. So I think it's that kind of exactly as you said, that kind of building those alliances, kind of building up that these things are to benefit you. Climate action is to benefit you as well. It's not to take things away. You know, there are lots of ways in which action on the climate makes your lives better. It makes public transport cheaper, makes your bills cheaper, and kind of hitting that home and making those kind of like concrete arguments as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I think you're really right. The way in which people are struggling to pay their utility bills is such a visceral issue. People here in the US and in New York in particular don't always understand that the utilities they're paying in these exorbitant monthly fees to are private for-profit corporations, not genuinely public utilities. So there's a lot of kind of educational work that has to be done to help people actually understand the structure of the grid and to understand that they're getting gouged by private corporations, and we could have a public alternative if we fought hard enough for it. So it's great to hear that that kind of argument is something that resonates in Scotland as well. And I think that you're right. Unless people understand there is an alternative, it's all too easy for the fascists to blame, the usual parties for inflation. It's the fault of the immigrants is the favorite one of MAGA here in the US, and I'm sure it's the case for the right wing in the UK as well. So, Rosie, I've asked you a bunch of questions. I have more, but I want to let others jump in. I feel like you've given us a wonderful sort of overview of the history of struggles for energy transition there in Scotland, and what some of the big obstacles are and how folks are organizing to move things forward. So we have a couple of questions. Tim asked about how the public sector is still dependent on the private sector for supplying and building the infrastructure, which is something I think you touched on earlier when you were talking about sort of the possibility of reindustrialization or an industrial policy, but maybe you could say more about that. And then Nick is asking about network building and relations between legislative political fights and more militant actions in the UK and Scotland. And yeah, I had a question about that too, because the UK passed, a horrendously draconian law prohibiting any kind of protests, kind of climate or environmental direct action on roads and other places. So to what extent is that a challenge for folks who are fighting for energy transition? To build a little bit on Nick's question.
Yeah, to take the first question, absolutely. Like there are so many parallels about the kind of dominance of and dependence on the private sector for kind of supplying and building the infrastructure needed for the energy transition. I think across every sector, not just within energy. We were speaking to kind of union comrades in the construction sector as well, and it's the kind of same picture replicated there and kind of drawing those links. So to give an example from our kind of local campaign in Peterhead, we were looking at the potential for a new construction, the construction of the new gas-fired power station, which is meant to have carbon capture attached. And we were digging into some of the jobs figures that were being reported by the developer, SSE. And they were kind of, you dug through and you saw that they were committed to 50 operational jobs at the new plant, which in all of their kind of press and stuff is pitched as like, this is what will happen when we close the original one. There are like 83 people working at the current plant. So the new power station will not even cover all of those jobs in theory. And they're not set out in a way that it's set to do that. But like the argument there, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I think that I can tell you what that was. We are due to have red weather warning here tomorrow in Scotland. And I think that was like
Thanks.
it was, yeah, which is kind of apt, given what
Yeah.
we're talking about. But that was the emergency alert on my phone coming through to let me know to stay inside. So it's kind of poetic. But yeah, so
What's
essentially
happening that you have to stay inside? What's the alert about?
it's Storm Owen. So yeah, a red warning for wind has been issued, extremely strong winds from 10 a.m. with a danger to life potentially. So um yeah, I just got the alert on my phone to say, and my phone, my personal phone and my work phone are sat here, so it was like doubly on doubly loud for you three, you four, I'm sure. Um but yes, to say that again, essentially the operational jobs don't cover. And then we looked and they said we're going to have maybe 1,500 construction jobs based with this plant, but 75% of them will go to people who don't live in the local authority area because the skills aren't there to do this kind of construction. So, and then you kind of turn to the construction sector and what's needed to decarbonize that. And our kind of union comrades there are saying, yeah, it's a massively fragmented and casualized sector. People are on poor contracts, are never asked back, and it makes it incredibly difficult to think about how we might transition because it's a really privatized industry. There's no kind of like centralized kind of construction, company or sector of kind of Scottish government that would be able to kind of do that. So we're completely dependent on the mercy of the market who dictate the pace in terms of the transition
Yeah,
always.
I think this is such an important point. So it's a lack of planning and a lack of capacity. And these two things are both really important. Just to give an example from here in the US, one of the big problems in building offshore wind turbine farms is that we literally don't have enough boats to put up the
Mhm.
wind turbines. So, first of all, as I was saying, there's this question of where the wind turbines are going to be built and by whom, what the facilities are going to be, which is obviously a social justice kind of question. But even if theoretically we could win those struggles, we don't have enough boats to take the turbines out to the sites where they should be actually put up offshore. This is ridiculous. This is a country that during World War II was building four massive uh, ships to transport supplies across the Atlantic a day. The U.S. built 6,000 ships during World War II. Uh, so it just really underlines the extent to which deindustrialization is a huge issue, and how if we really are going to have kind of green transition, we need to redo all of that, and mobilize quite massively. I know a lot of people look back to World War II and say we need something of that scale in order to cope with this crisis. But just in terms of these issues of capacity and coordination and planning, it's also obvious. So thanks for pointing that out, Rosie. And it's obviously clear all over the place. Nancy, you have a question.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to apologize for having to bow out in the middle of I'm in Mexico and we have the opposite problem. But so my internet wasn't as reliable as I'd like. But Rosie, thank you so much. It's really so helpful to have an understanding, and you're such a clear speaker and thinker, about what your struggle is like and what are the overlaps. But I'm wondering if the very terrible example of the United States moving toward a fascist society and how the center left has failed to speak to the working class and to get the support that is needed for survival, right? Um, I don't know if has that had any currency to encourage the left of center forces to think about what are they demanding, how are they presenting. I don't know. I guess my hope is that others can learn from our terrible failure,
And
but I don't know if that's
if I
happening.
could just ask you if you could piggyback on that really important question from Nancy. I don't think you got to Nick's question about direct action and the ways that that's been made illegal, because of course that's happened in red states. I think it's now illegal in 30 states across the US to engage in any kind of protest, even if it's completely nonviolent, near what's called essential infrastructure like a pipeline. So yeah, turn it back over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, and yeah, thank you for your comments. I'll start with the less hopeful picture at the beginning of my answer and then hopefully end a bit better. But in terms of at a state level, it's been hugely, hugely disappointing just to watch our kind of like Labour government, you know, react in the first few days following the inauguration, you know, and the kind of display that went on, and kind of the reaction from that. The kind of yeah, the Nazi salute from Elon Musk was put to number 10, and they said they hadn't seen it and they had no comment on it. And, you know, former kind of you know, one of the kind of ministers in government, David Lammy, who 10 years ago, maybe less, was kind of calling Trump a racist and saying all these things. And, you know, if he came here, he would say it to him and things like that. And now it's all the special relationship and we'll be working together across things. It's complete cowardice. So I think the lessons from you know, the United States are completely lost on the Starmer government and his kind of cabal. And to be honest, I think they're going to be negated more because there's kind of whispers from kind of party insiders that Starmer's opinion poll is polling so lowly that there might be a coup, but it'll be a coup from the right. The left of the Labour Party is pretty beaten down, I think, after the Corbyn failure, and also just the way in which the party have continued to crack down on the remaining left-wing MPs that we have. A lot of them were lost the whip after a vote on the kind of two-child benefit cap here in the UK. A couple of like the core voices essentially lost. Yeah, and I don't think that's back yet. So I think at that kind of top level, we're not seeing any learnings being taken. I think if anything, they think, well, the answer is to kind of appeal more to what is being said there rather than kind of thinking through what it actually means and what, as you say, like communicating to the working class, these kind of issues in a way that says this would improve your material conditions, not this kind of laissez-faire, like, sorry, we've got to balance the books again, we've got to constrain the budget, yous are just going to have to put up with more of the same, if not worse, for the next 4 years, and then being surprised when the reform and the right get in. I would like to say, to kind of reclaim that a little bit, is that the organized left, I think, are attempting to grapple with that a bit more. I don't want to be naive about how far we have to go, and I don't want to romanticize like what I think we're doing. But I think in Scotland, I'm very heartened by the community organizing and the kind of grassroots work that's going on in the climate movement, but then also in other kind of sites of struggle, such as within housing and tenants unions here, such as Live and Rent, and kind of making those struggles, being out in neighborhoods and kind of taking direct action that actually, again, kind of makes people's lives better. We're on the cusp of winning rent controls through the Scottish government, which just would not have happened without the kind of work of grassroots tenants unions either. We're doing very well with our kind of campaign to stop Peterhead, but we are very, the new gas-fired power station there, but we're very cognizant that just stopping something is not enough. You have to provide that alternative in the way that you have already outlined. And, you know, the work of that kind of community organizing will continue long after fossil fuels have been stopped, and kind of thinking through how to do that. And that is kind of set in the context of, as Nick's question outlines, of a really repressive state and, you know, kind of police force when it comes to kind of direct action. We're lucky in kind of loose terms in Scotland of like some of the worst kind of restrictions of that, you know, the kind of act that you referred to don't apply to us, and kind of policing in Scotland, but that doesn't really, as you know, it doesn't give you any comfort because your comrades across the UK are seeing the same thing. Environmental protesters are being preemptively arrested for joining Zoom meetings to think that they would be attending something. When we, you know, there's been a lot of really violent policing in Scotland recently with Palestine protesters, at different kind of industrial forces as well. So even if in name the law doesn't apply here, that doesn't dampen kind of police violence and repression of protest as well. And that is it's just such a distraction as well. Like it takes up your organizing time, having to weigh that up and think about, you know, is this worth it? Like, what about the, you know, safety of members? Like, how are we weighing up what we take and when you feeling as though you can't be as kind of gung-ho as you maybe once were, which is really not the place you want to be in, and thinking about, you know, dealing with the police. But I'm hopeful that there's enough kind of the kind of complement of direct action alongside the kind of community level organizing, and the two things are linked, but it doesn't, yeah, there's just, it is really challenging. And I think it hits home how that kind of like criticism of state power and policing has to come into all that we talk about when we talk about organizing and talking about kind of transformative change. And I think that's one thing in which we can always work on, I think, within the Scottish climate movement, which we've been trying to kind of build those alliances more strongly. Because I think previously there have been quite fair criticisms of that being kind of lacking and have it lacking that analysis of like how that repression can take place when none of us are immune to it, and kind of distancing yourselves from more radical actors who are at the face of like state repression and police brutality. It always encroaches in on you. If you're challenging state power, you will be subject to it, so we need to always foreground that kind of solidarity and things. So I think, yeah, we always try, especially because I work for an NGO, so it's always really incumbent on us not to be the quote unquote like respectable voice, and to never kind of punch down on more grassroots like direct action groups who are taking that. People often ask us, like in the press and things, Friends of the Year Scotland, you're nice and things like that. What about those Raj Just Stop Oil people who are blocking roads and things? It's like it's a collective responsibility to say that is part of the struggle, and to not say, well, we're not them. Like, so there's different roles in which you want to kind of play to make sure that you're not delegitimizing what is a very crucial and effective site of struggle, which people are, losing their livelihoods for. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really important to be in solidarity with direct action. Going back to the theme that I struck at the outset, we both live in petrostates, and the elites will use the state to crack down on anyone who is challenging the right to keep pumping gas and oil out of the ground and making money off it. So very important to fight that criminalization, and to fight for abolition more broadly. So we are just past the top of the hour. We should probably let you go, Rosie. I want to thank you so much for your time and for all your brilliant insights, and to thank everyone else who tuned in today with wonderful questions. We'll be putting this video up online to share more broadly. And Rosie, I hope we'll stay in touch, and that our movements can work in solidarity, because we need those connections to keep fighting for just transition and for the world we need to build going forward.
That'd be great. Thank you so much for having me on, and thank you to all of you for your great questions. It's been really great and really heartening to be here and chatting among, comrades as well. It's been fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you. And we will distribute the recording, because it's really so valuable.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I really look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
See you later.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.